Hello, I'm Tom Brokaw, and welcome to our conversation with Heroes of D-Day, presented by the American Veterans Center and the United States of America World War II 75th commemoration of that historic day that will linger for all of us forever, as well as it should. And we're more than honored to have with us two veterans of that great invasion that will live on forever. Major General John Raaen, United States Army. He landed with the 5th Ranger Battalion at Omaha Beach, decorated with the Silver Star. And Ray Lambert, United States Army, medic with the 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division at Omaha Beach, also decorated with the Silver Star. And before all of that, of course, he landed in the Italian campaign. And so, Ray, let's begin with you. When you were growing up, did you expect it would go into this kind of a war and have that kind of a role?
No, of course I didn't know. I was in Alabama, and it was just before the Depression, and things were very poor there. And I was born on November the 26th, 1920. And after I went to school, got through grade schools, and that time we used to walk to school rather than ride a bus. And after a while, I'll move on to high school. I played football and baseball, and finally my father was hurt and I had to go to work to help the family. So I didn't have money to continue my education. So I took a lot of different jobs that I did. And one of the jobs that I had in the summertime, I was assistant veterinarian in Chilton County, Alabama. And I worked at that. My job was to inoculate dogs for rabies. And I did that all one summer. And then jobs got to a point that there was nothing really that I could get at that age. So I decided to join the service, and I went to Montgomery, Alabama, and went to the recruiting office and talked to the recruiting sergeant there in Maxwell Field, Alabama, which is still there. And he asked me what I'd been doing, and I told him I'd been working as the assistant veterinarian in Chilton County, Alabama. And he says, good, we'll put you in the medics. So I assumed that he thought if I could give dogs a shot that I could take care of the dog faces. At that time we were called. So that put me into the service. And I asked him, told him I'd like to get with a fighting unit, and not knowing what I was really getting into at that time, I would have never said that. But he put me in the 1st Division, and that's how he ended up in the medics in the 1st Division.
Ray, that's a fantastic story, and that's how so many veterans got into the Army. In fact, they showed up and then they were assigned. But in your case, he had a good sense of your background. General Raaen, I want to ask you, you were at the military academy when the war broke out, and you come from a military family. So in 1943, as I remember, is when you got out of the military academy. What was it like at West Point at that time? Was there an enormous amount of anticipation, but also apprehension about what they were about to get involved in?
I don't think there was any apprehension. I think everybody that I can think of, everybody I knew, they all were eager to get out, get to their units, train with their units, and then go to war.
But you had kind of an unusual assignment because you ended up with Special Forces. I mean, it was the beginning of a legendary time in the American military. And yet you had been trained really at West Point and during your training for another kind of job. Isn't that true?
Well, you really weren't trained for a specific job at West Point. You were trained to be an officer, and that required that you have a certain academic background, certain military background, and things like that. But to really answer your question, Bill Darby, who was the first commander of the Rangers, the 1st Ranger Battalion, Bill Darby was my predecessor at West Point, which means we were appointed by the same congressman. So when Bill Darby started hitting the pages of Life magazine, as he first formed the Ranger Battalion, and second, they participated in the Dieppe raids and things like that, I said, I just want to get in the Rangers and follow Bill Darby. Actually, I followed him to West Point. Why not follow him into the Rangers? So it was always my goal to get into the Rangers upon graduation. However, I ended up in the engineers, the Corps of Engineers, and served in the 10th Armored Division for, about 6 months. And while we were on Tennessee maneuvers in the 10th Armored Division, there was a recruiting call put out, the recruiting call for the 5th Ranger Infantry Battalion. And I responded. And even though I was in the engineers, they selected me for an infantry battalion. And that's how I got into the Rangers.
Tell me about when you landed at Pointe du Hoc and the chaos that must have been overwhelming in a lot of ways, even though you'd been highly trained for where you were going to be and what you were expected to do. But at that moment, you went up against that sheer cliff.
No,
I've talked to other veterans who were there as well. And it's hard for me, I think, from this distance, and also having not experienced anything remotely like that, to understand how anybody could put one foot in front of the other.
well, first, I didn't go with those 3 companies of the 2nd Ranger Battalion that landed at Pointe du Hoc. My battalion was supposed to go into Pointe du Hoc, but we got waved off when the 2nd Battalion was late. We went to Vierville, tried to land there, but landing control waved us off of there, said go to White Beach. So we went to White Beach and landed our first wave on White Beach, and it was nearly wiped out. So the battalion commander, or the force commander, Lieutenant Colonel Schneider, had the British move us down 800 yards, and we landed on Dog Red Beach. And Dog Red Beach was horrible. Absolutely horrible. But we landed in a place that was very, very lucky, because the bluffs were afire from naval gunfire. And that meant that the people on top of the bluffs who were shooting down on us couldn't even see us. As a matter of fact, at least half of them, when the flames got near their emplacements, they just took up their sidearms and ran. So we didn't have much fire from above us, but we had a tremendous amount of fire from the right. Now, we had landed in an area where the French had put in 15, they call them retards. They were not seawalls, but breakers. And these breakers were about 5 feet high, 4 feet, 5 feet high, made of huge rock, and placed about 25 yards apart. And they were just like little forts. Once you got up into them, you didn't have to worry about the fire from the right if you kept your head down. So we actually got across the beach with only 5 casualties when other people were taking 50 and 60% casualties. As a result, it was no problem at all to get the battalion off the beach, up the bluffs, and into the bocage, the hedgerows.
And Ray, let me ask you, you had an advantage, in a matter of speaking, when you landed in Omaha, because you'd been through the Italian landings.
Yeah.
And I've talked to a number of veterans, and those who were best equipped to land on D-Day were those who had been through another invasion. Was that your experience as well? And what was the most important thing you learned from that first experience?
Yes, once we went through the invasion of Sicily, which was a little harder and more severe than the one in North Africa. In bringing my men in and talking to them, it was very important to try to get them to not listen to the loud noises, which is a very fearing thing. Noise can get you off, get you off thinking, stop you from realizing what you're doing. So I ask them just concentrate on their job and continue doing their job and not think about anything else. So that worked out pretty well that way. And I used that same, after we had replacements after Sicily and training the new replacements, we used the same tactics there at Omaha Beach. Everyone was talking about whether they had the courage to go in from the boats and face the machine guns that were right in front of us. And again, what we tried to do was just think of what we were doing and not think about what we were getting into. So it's the courage is something we here talk about, but you never know if you have courage to do something until it's time to use it. And when we went in to the Omaha Beach there and the ramps went down, we were walking directly into the machine gun fire that was right on the hillside in front of us. So I don't know if I would say that I had the courage to do it, or it was just to stick to training, try to do our job the best we could. But it's a feeling that you have that you're trained to do and keep your mind on trying to save the guys from drowning and patch them up best you can. So that's what I had told my men, and that's what we did there. Just keep our mind on our job.
But Ray, I know from our experience there together, you were wounded more than once in doing your duty.
Yes, I was, when the ramp went down, I was standing in the left front corner and something went right through my right elbow. And I'm not sure, it wasn't a very big thing, but it was something, could have been shrapnel or fragmentation, but it went right through my right elbow. And my arm was not very usable, but I kept using it anyway. And so I went in under the water and started getting guys that were hung up on the barbed wire out and continued to get them out and put tourniquets on where I could. And the next time I was wounded, I had a big piece of fragmentation, obviously, that hit my left thigh and knocked a hole in my thigh about the size of your hand and right to the bone. And I got out of the water when that happened and put a tourniquet on, gave myself a shot of morphine and went back in the water again to save more guys. And there was one guy there that had his hand up, and I knew that he was calling for help because I couldn't see him, only his hand. And I went under the water and got him. He was hung up on the barbed wire, and I finally got him out. It was his life preserver that was hung up on the barbed wire. And I unbuckled his life preserver and got him loose from the barbed wire and started to go out, take him out from under the water to the beach area. And the boat came in and he dropped his ramp, and the ramp hit me right in the back and crushed my back and took both of us right to the bottom. And I had this guy in my arm, and I asked, I knew at that time that it looked like we both were going to die right there because this big ramp had us pushed right to the sand. And I asked God at that time to give me one more chance to save this man. So some reason the ramp went up and I got the guy out of there, crawled out. I couldn't walk, and I crawled out to the beach. And I don't know why to this day that ramp went up, whether it was too much firepower and they backed out, or the waves pushed the boat away and they raised the ramp. But anyway, that saved my life right there when the ramp went up and I crawled out to the beach. Those are the times that I was wounded.
We want to get back in a moment to the great boulder that the Germans inadvertently rolled down onto the beach, and it became a shelter for you. You took wounded veterans and put them behind that boulder and saved their lives. You and I were there together.
Yes.
And in fact, there's a commemoration of your role in all of that. But here's the question I ask a lot of veterans about D-Day and also those who are in horrendous combat. Do you still think on a regular basis about what you went through? One veteran said to me, I can't remember what I had for breakfast yesterday, but I remember every waking moment on Iwo Jima. Does it still come into your mind all these years later?
Every day of my life, I remember that. I remember everything that happened to me there. And I remember talking to my men, Myers, and some of the other guys. And at night, I think of this a lot and think of those men. And even back to the time that we were in Africa and we first made our invasion there. I remember those things. I remember talking to the men and the expressions on their faces and treating wounded guys and have the guys ask me if they're going to live. And all those things, Tom, are just regular part of my life now. And it gives me kind of a little relief when I can sit out on my back deck here and look out on the lake and see the waves there sometime and remember all those things that happened. And when the Germans, the big boulder there that you're referring to, was the Germans had poured concrete, I guess more than they needed, and they had poured that and then moved it down off the bed into the water. And there was nothing else that I could see that was going to shield the wounded or give us a chance to treat the wounded better. And while I was looking directly at the machine gunner, it was firing at us, I looked to the left to see if I could see something because the bullets were kicking up the water all around us. And I saw that boulder. And I told my guys then to try to get as many of the guys that we could and the walking wounded to that boulder and get behind it. As you know, it's not a great large boulder, but it was certainly big enough to get some of the guys there behind it and treat them. And that's what we did. And thank God for that boulder that was there.
We have a number of other distinguished participants in this session as well, a new generation of American military people. And I know that many of them have a question as well. Cadet Noah, do you have a question for the guest that we have here today?
Similar to how veterans nowadays, coming back from wars in the Middle East, are struggling to adjust to civilian life, did you have any problems adjusting to civilian life after the war?
It's a difficult question for me to answer. I had no problems when I left the Army, but I stayed in the Army for 36 years as a commissioned officer and retired as a Major General, and just went into a very pleasant life, mostly playing golf and things like that, going to barbecues and enjoying my family. I did not take a job in industry. I did a little bit of consulting at first, but it was relatively minor, didn't last very long. So I had no problem with adjustment. I was very, very happy to be retired and playing golf.
I was, after D-Day, I was in a hospital in England for several months and then sent back to the States. I was in a hospital in New York, Halloween General Hospital. After that, they sent me to the Thomasville General Hospital in Georgia. I was there for about 2 months, and then I went to the Daytona Convalescent Hospital in Daytona, Florida. My son was born when I was in Africa. I had never seen him, and I'd had no communication other than V letters with my wife. So it had been, my son then was almost 4 years old. And so that was the first time that I got to see my son and my wife after I came back. I was in a hospital there recruiting and recuperating. And we lived in a small little place there. And I was discharged at Fort McPherson. When I was discharged, I had $275. That's all I had. And I was I lost weight. I was very nervous. I was very quick to respond to things. And of course, I did have some problems that bothered me. What I did when I was discharged was to not concentrate on my problems or worry about myself, but concentrate on my wife and my son and what I needed to do to have a life with them. So I immediately started looking for where I was going to live. I had no home, of course. So my brother was in Massachusetts at that time. He had married a nurse that was in the Army, and he wanted me to come there. So I went there and I started to work for $21 a week, and then going to school under the GI Bill and not thinking of my problems at all, but concentrating on taking care of my family. And that kind of took care of my cure for myself. And we did very well. And that's what happened when I first came out.
Those are important lessons, Ray, for everybody, and whatever the time and whatever war they happen to be in. We have one of our other panelists, so to speak, is here from the Naval Academy, Midshipman Jacqueline. You have a question for these people? And I have to say parenthetically that women were involved in D-Day, but primarily in the, in the back and the taking care of people as they came into the hospitals, and they did heroic work, and they were up very close to the front lines. A lot of them were decorated. All that has changed now. Women have a more active, more conspicuous role. And in the Naval Academy, I know personally that that's the case. You have questions for these gentlemen?
Yes, sir, I do. First of all, thank you for sharing your stories, gentlemen. And I think my question, Mr. Lambert, you kind of highlighted on earlier, but it goes for both of you. At USNA, we've learned since plebe year, plebe summer, and even like now, that Stoicism plays a significant role in being able to lead and execute a mission efficiently. So, with such a significant experience as yours, what was the defining moment in which that concept stuck? And what advice or knowledge would you give to midshipmen and cadets for understanding, embracing, and mastering Stoicism as we enter the fleet and graduate?
One thing as leaders that you're obviously going to be in the service, that it's important to uh, get your troops or get the men that you're leading to trust you. That is very important. There are several ways that you can do that, is to exemplify a good leadership yourself. Always do what you say you're going to do, and never expect your men to do something that you're not willing to do yourself. The other thing that I did with my men was to try to get them in situations so they could relax at times. And one way I did that was to get to know their names of their wives and their children, rather than to say to a guy when we were in combat, uh, having a lot of patients coming in, and guys are working day and night. Rather than to say to him how your wife is, I would say, how is Jane and Johnny? And that would bring immediately a connection between me and my men. And that's, I think, my men really enjoyed that, because they felt that I cared enough about them to know their family and ask them about their family. And of course, the other thing is that you yourself have to exemplify, as I said before, good leadership, and be willing to step up anytime that becomes necessary.
General, I want to ask you a question. You had a long, distinguished military career in a variety of important posts. And one of the big changes in American military, obviously, and we just saw that reflected, is that there are more women taking more active roles up through the ranks now. So, General Raaen, can you just share with us your own experience with that transition?
The main thing is that before women began to appear as military officers and have military jobs, we had a large number of Department of the Army civilian women working for us. So I was quite used to working with women in technical jobs and things like that. There was no particular problem. I did have a problem with the first female officer that I sat or shared a desk with. And the problem was, she didn't have to go home and mow the grass. She didn't have to take the children to the emergency room at 3 a.m. or anything like that. She was a professional and she did her job beautifully. And I'll guarantee you that every time since then that I have served with female officers, they've all been approximately the same: dedicated, competent, and hard to keep up with.
Let's go back and look at the panel again and see if we can't get some of these rising young military people.
So my question is, when you're facing such extreme danger, like you did on Omaha Beach, you talked about how your training was very important. Was there anything else like intrinsic, like your family or thoughts of your fellow soldiers that motivated you to perform your duties?
No, after D-Day and after a while, I heard rumors, actually were rumors, that guys were calling for their mama, they wanted their mama, all those kind of things. I never heard one soldier out there cry or ask for his mama or anything like that. And when you're in combat like that, and all the noise and everything around you is happening, you really don't think, I didn't at least think of my family at all at the time. All I was concentrating on was to stay alive, take care of the guys that were wounded. So after D-Day and I was in the hospital, at that time I was concerned about what my mother and father would think and that what my wife would, how they were and things like that. But during those times that we were in fighting there, no, I did not think of anyone other than just doing my job and trying to stay alive.
Well, first and foremost, I would like to greatly thank everybody for the opportunity. And my question is for both veterans, actually. So as two people who fought valiantly against the evils of Nazi Germany, how does it feel to see people waving the Nazi flag today?
General, you want to take a shot at that?
Sure, sure. I think it's abominable. I think it's unforgivable. I think it should be punishable. But unfortunately, we don't do that in our society anymore. As you can see, I am a conservative and believe in the fact that we should obey the laws as they are written and not try to interpret them wildly. I think that's about all there is to be said before I really get nasty.
Well, General, let me steer you to another issue that I hear constantly now from active military officers, and that is the poor physical condition that the recruits and the people arrive at camp are in. They've had to extend basic training by several weeks. They've had to change everything because the current generation is just in terrible shape and doesn't have a kind of, if you will, inner force to get in shape or an idea exactly about why they're in the military. Were you aware of that?
Yes, I was. I'd heard figures and all the way from only 30% or 20%, something in that region of the recruits are in physical condition that is good enough to serve, and that they do have to extend the basic training just to get them into the kind of physical shape that you need to carry a gun and bayonet in a military fashion. No, I've heard the same thing. And as I look around, I see a lot more obesity than we used to see in people. And I think it was just the way we lived. Most of us in my time were coming out of the Depression where you didn't have the opportunity to be obese. We had plenty of food to stay alive. My father was in the Army, as you know, and we always had the commissaries and the PXs and things like that to take care of our basic needs. But it is very disturbing when you just go out and look at a crowd of high school kids and you see that at least 50% of them are obese by my standards.
People used to walk where they were going, and now if they're going a block, half a block down the street, they get in a car and drive down there. On my high school football team, which I still have a roster, the heaviest guy on the team was 145 pounds. Now you look at high school football teams and they got guys that are 200, 225 pounds on there. And in the Army in World War II, I never saw an overweight soldier in the Army. Everyone was trim and neat and tough. And back when I was a kid, children, young people played in there with their neighbors and got a lot of exercise. And now they don't do that. They sit down and watch television or sit and text. They don't go out and get the exercise they did before. And Tom, I think that is one of the reasons that we see so many people overweight now.
Well, I do think it's a national issue, and I don't think it's gotten the kind of attention that it deserves. I always remember a couple of my friends that I talked to about what it was like to go from working on a farm in Kansas or to, you know, working in a trucking business somewhere and then be in the military. I said, was it an adjustment? They said, are you kidding? Working on a farm in Kansas in the middle of the summer? There's nothing harder than that. And then they would say, I never had so much to eat in my life. I never had a new pair of boots. I never had a new pair of trousers. Everything was a hand-me-down. So it was a different generation, frankly,
Okay.
that came into play at that time. Let's go now and let me see some of the cadets as well and pick out another question from these distinguished young men and women. There you are.
Yes, sir. So another question for you, gentlemen. You said you were both pretty motivated to join when you signed up. And so after D-Day, after the war and everything, what was your experiences or sort of your outlook on war and just sort of the world in general after everything happened?
The way I looked at things is that there are times when it's really necessary to fight a war. And we, in World War II, that was necessary. And had we failed on D-Day, things could have been entirely different. Hitler had an army that was well thought of, trained, equipment, and all the things. When we met them in North Africa, the Germans had everything that we were fighting them with, they had better at that time. And another one of the problems that you and others that are coming along now should remember is that when we landed in North Africa, our guys did not know how to fight. And the other thing that was wrong there was no communication between the officers and the men. And before we went overseas, you would never have an officer sit down with an enlisted man and talk to him. And it was always that distance that they had. And I had just this past week, I had two of the top generals from Fort Bragg come to my house, and we had a great conversation. They are in charge of the Air Corps and the ground forces there. And we had a good conversation about that very thing, that the officers today will communicate with their soldiers or stop and talk to one of their soldiers. Before we went overseas in World War II, you did not have that connection. And that, when General Allen was our commander and one of the most beloved generals of all, and he said, until the officers get to know their men and were willing to talk to their men, that they are not going to be the fighting men that they should be. But we did get that happening. And after a while, as you know, we turned out to be the best fighters of all there. But that's very important.
And General, let's let you weigh in on that. Have you seen a change, if you will, in the professional DNA of people who rise to senior ranks in the military and how they conduct themselves? You know, I've been covering the wars in Iraq and around the world with this new military that we have, and I'm always very, very impressed with the kind of intellectual capacity they have and a sense of history and dealing with the new challenges that are out there. So, General, could you just tell us from your point of view what you're seeing from the senior military ranks in the officer corps now and how it's been changed for the better?
Well, I think it has changed for the better, but the main thing I notice is that when we were in the Rangers in World War II. We were very, very conscious of our enlisted men. The officers participated in the bullpen, the telephone pull, push, and all of those things, training on a physical and very personal basis. We knew all of the men by their first names, and they were often used. Occasionally, as a matter of fact, the sergeants were a lot more severe on the regular enlisted men than the officers were. But we did try to treat them as human beings. And as a result, we got very good results out of it. Of course, in the Rangers, we were lucky. All we had to do was to say, you're no longer in the Rangers, and the man had to go back to his original unit. And for several of them, it was the disciplinary barracks at Fort Leavenworth. So we had no trouble with discipline because most people enjoyed the job that they had in the Rangers. The training was interesting, though severe, but almost everybody enjoyed what we were doing. By the time we got to Normandy and actually made the landing on the beaches, it was training that kept everybody going. Nobody, including myself, ever even worried about family. All we were thinking about was, what am I going to do? Where am I? What's on that hill? I was observing constantly. Now, it was a month or two ago, I just decided to sit down and write everything that I thought of on the beach while I was on the beach. And I wrote down 37 things in a space of about 2 minutes of the things that I observed on the beach. And that's what I was doing, was making sure that I knew exactly where I was, exactly where I was going, exactly where every man was his equipment in reasonably good shape. And I counted on the non-coms for that. They're the ones that checked equipment. I want to say a couple of things about Ray Lambert that he hasn't said. When I landed, the water was within 100 yards, I would say even 75 yards of the seawall. And the problem was to get out of the boats and get up to the seawall. I told you about the breakwaters, which extended out about 25 yards. Once you got to that 25 yards from the seawall, you were pretty safe. The interesting thing is, all the German artillery was shooting down at the water, at the boats, because if they hit a boat, they might disable 250 men if it was an LCI or something like that. And if it was a landing craft assault, it was 35 men. So we who had already gotten up on the beach were faced with mostly small arms, a little bit of mortar, and things like that. The artillery was hitting down there in the water. And Ray said several times that he really didn't get out of the water, that he was tending to people until they found that big boulder there. And then they were going back to the water and dragging people up to the big boat, to the big boulder. That was where the artillery was hitting, right down there where he was doing his work. So I have to say, I really admire him for that particular aspect of doing his duty. He was where the danger was. I was up where they were just shooting small arms at me.
Every time I talk with somebody who landed on day, they say you cannot overstate the chaos, the two of you, the enormous sounds of combat and men dying and the chaos all around you, you know, flights coming in from overhead, all the ordnance that was being unloaded from the sea, all the ordnance that was being unloaded from the land and everything. Do you still hear that in your own mind? The chaos of everything. I mean, does it come to you?
Many times at night, I still wake up hearing the noise and the machine gun bullets flying by. We had field jackets on, as you know, Tom, and I had a machine gun bullet go through the arm of my field jacket. And there's so much happening that you really don't, it's hard to pick out one thing that is worse than other. It was just a terrible, terrible situation where there was no place that I could see in that water where you could get without having machine gun bullets hitting the water or the artillery falling and knocking out some of the boats. And some of the boats, I think G Company was one boat that every man on that Higgins boat was killed when the ramp went down. And it was just, I think you could get as many stories on D-Day as it were guys that went through that and were not killed there. Because everyone has a little different thing, but it was just a terrible situation. And it's very hard to explain it, really, but it was.
General, let me ask you, was there
Yeah.
any way that you could have been prepared for the chaos of the landing and all the briefings that you were given? And I have some
No.
understanding of what was going on about who was
No.
going to be where and when. But the chaos in the air and the gunshots and the people dying around you.
We were prepared to find a beach that was pockmarked with bomb craters. And of course, the Air Force came in vertically on the beach, and when they held up for 5 seconds, all the bombs landed inland. So we were attacking Virgin Beach, if you want to call it that. And that was a great disappointment. But the thing that people never mention is the smells. I mean, we had fires, gasoline fires, leather was being burned, what passed for plastic in those days was being burned, human flesh was being burned, and the odors were terrible. The noise was terrible. There was artillery hitting about approximately 30 yards away and down among the boats. And the small arms cracking over our heads. You don't hear the shot. What you hear is the bullet as it goes over your head, or I hope it goes over your head, and you hear the shock wave of the bullet. So the sounds are really tremendous, and they are very close to you. When they pop over your head 5 feet away from you, you hear it as being 5 feet away from you, and it is a loud, frightening noise. And the Germans, with their MG-42s and MG-34s, were putting out thousands of rounds over our heads. We were protected, as I say, by those breakwaters, but the breakwaters really made the difference for us, and that's the reason we were able to get a 500-man battalion across the beach with only 5 casualties. We were just lucky, I guess.
Well, my personal experience with D-Day, as a lot of people know by now, my first memories of life were about the war. I was living on an Army base in southwestern South Dakota. I wore a helmet to class in the morning when I was in the kindergarten. And then D-Day came, obviously, and there was a great elation about what was going on. I caught the wave of the post-war years. My father had a good job working for the Corps of Engineers and building a big dam, and life went on. And then the 40th anniversary of D-Day came along, and I was the principal correspondent for NBC, and we decided to go over there and do a story about D-Day. And I went thinking, I'm going to drink some Calvados, I'm going to run on the beach, I'm going to meet some interesting people. And on the first day that I was there, I walked onto the beach with 2 members of the Big Red One. One had lost both legs later. And it was a life-changing experience for me because I take a certain amount of pride in being a realistic reporter, but nothing could have prepared me for what I was seeing and hearing that day. And that ignited this lifelong interest, not just in D-Day, but in the combat of World War II. And I'm always, as I have been this morning, inspired by the veterans who were there and also by the new generation coming along. I do a lot of teaching, so to speak, at West Point, and I've been honored at the Naval Academy. And I am just inalterably impressed by the generation now coming of age and dedicating themselves to what this country is going to need to defend itself in the modern years. But the lessons of D-Day will be with us forever and for history forever as well. So I want to thank all of you for participating in this. Share it with your friends and keep it in your heart and in your mind.